Good evening, everyone. And thank you once again for joining us at the New Republic for yet another live stream event. This one's called America After the Age of Milton Friedman. My name is Jason Linkins, and I'm the deputy editor of the politics section at TNR's website. Earlier today, I came across a single panel cartoon from artist Tom Toro that really put me in a mood for tonight. The cartoon depicts some future, blasted dystopia, and there's a single adult sitting around a makeshift campfire with three children. And he's telling these children tales of the before times. Yes, the planet gets destroyed, he tells the kids, but for a beautiful moment, we created a lot of value for shareholders. Now, that this joke resonates with us is something that we can credit to Milton Friedman. In 1970, Milton Friedman published a treatise in the New York Times that made it explicit that the social responsibility of business is to increase its profits ahead of all other concerns. As TNR columnist Bruce Bartlett wrote witheringly last year, this is one of Friedman's many ideas that has distorted the economic consensus in the halls of power in Washington. Elsewhere, Bartlett has criticized Friedman for influencing Paul Volcker to adopt destructive libertarian ideas when Volcker became the chairman of the Federal Reserve in 1979. Whether you're a critic or an adherent of Friedmanism, you have to give him his due. It's rare that a figure casts such a long shadow over the Washington consensus. It's rarer still when such a figure gets widely embraced by both conservatives and liberals, as Friedman successfully managed to do. His work heavily influenced acolytes in successive Democratic administrations, including President Barack Obama's. But is Friedman's long shadow finally starting to fade? One of our guests tonight has posited in the New Republic's most recent issue that President Joe Biden is finally ushering Friedmanism from the scene. And what might take its place might have massive implications for both our economy and our democracy. So tonight, let's meet our panel. First up, the aforementioned guest. He is the author of our most recent cover feature, The End of Friedmanomics, as well as his book, The Price of Peace, Money, Democracy, and the Life of John Maynard Keynes. Please welcome Zach Carter. She is the author of The Emerging Worldview, How New Progressivism is Moving Beyond Neoliberalism. She's also the president and CEO of the Roosevelt Institute. Please welcome Felicia Wong. And finally, he is a TNR staff writer for a few more hours, and then he is off to write a book about the future of democracy. Please welcome Osita Nwanevu. Now, tonight's discussion is going to be about an hour. We're hoping to cover as much ground as possible, and we're hoping that we can get to some of your questions tonight as well. So without further ado, we should just get started. Esteemed panel, there's obviously a kind of a constant debate among political economists and political figures, but it does seem that every once in a while someone emerges that has the intellectual fortitude, maybe the charisma, the ideas to create this sort of big seismic shift in our political consensus. Friedman, we're talking about him tonight. I wanted to state from the outset, I will probably say Thomas Friedman instead of Milton Friedman at least once, maybe twice. So forgive me for that. Is one. John Maynard Keynes is another. Before we consider Friedman's demise, as Zach has posited, I want to talk about the necessary societal conditions for a figure of this kind of magnitude to like so own the consensus, and whether we are at that kind of tipping point now. Obviously, the pandemic creates a lot of crises and a lot of opportunities, but I wanted to just get a sense of the moment we're at right now. Are we ripe for another sort of big shift in the political economic consensus? You guys seem real eager to get into it.
I've been thinking about this because my paymasters at the Hewlett Foundation and the Omidyar Network pay me to think about this quite a bit. And I think the answer is very complicated. If you think about paradigms in the Thomas Kuhn scientific revolution sense, they're often about data and about explanations for old theories no longer adding up. So the traditional Thomas Kuhn version of this is you have some theory that's hegemonic, And there start being outliers, things that don't quite fit in with the explanation. They have to be sort of ad hoc explanations. And eventually you have so many outliers that somebody comes up with a new explanation that replaces the old one and makes sense of all the outliers. In the case of Milton Friedman's kind of takeover of the economic consensus in the 1970s, none of that really happened. There was he came up with a historical narrative of the old order that was just false. He presented a new sort of prime mover in economic life, which was the money supply and the quantity of money. But he didn't really even define his terms particularly accurately. Or with much precision, I should say. I won't say accuracy is maybe the wrong word there, but and then the actual, working with the terms that he used, the data just didn't really make a whole lot of sense for the story that he was telling. What he had was an alternative explanation with a lot of political power behind it. And I think that for that to work, you do have to have some sort of social willingness to go along with the weight of this political movement. Particularly when the explanation is just not very good. And the explanation for monetarism and Friedmanism that emerged in the 1970s had been criticized by economists beforehand. I mean, he'd been pushing this for a decade before it really took over.
When we talk about monetarism, we're talking about a response to the New Deal and the desire among Friedman and his acolytes to unwind the New Deal.
Essentially a technical economic management scheme to unwind the entire New Deal state, the apparatus of government that had been created in the 1930s through the 1960s. And to create Friedman hoped a more kind of like libertarian place. It didn't quite work out that way, but it did do a lot, an enormous amount of damage. But I think it was really important that the existing theory was seen to have failed politically. I don't know if ordinary people walking around in the streets were thinking, aggregate demand really doesn't explain the rise in prices in the 1970s or something like that. But there was a sense politically that the coalitions that had made the Keynesian economic paradigm so powerful and so common sense for so long just wasn't holding together anymore. And it wasn't. And I don't think it was holding together for a lot of reasons. The most prominent in my mind is the Vietnam War. But there were all sorts of upheavals happening in the 1960s and 1970s. But social upheaval alone is not the thing. Social upheaval is happening all the time. You have to have political failure along with the social upheaval, and we had that in the Democratic Party in the late 1960s and early 1970s. I think largely due to Vietnam. Today, I think the financial crisis and the COVID crisis in quick succession have revealed an intellectual problem with the way that the Democratic Party was pursuing economic management under Barack Obama and Bill Clinton. I do not know if we have reached a point of, the Democratic Party's poor showing in the 2020 election, for instance, wasn't quite bad enough, right, to prevent Biden, to deny Biden the White House. And so it looks to me like Biden has really, this put the fear of God in Biden. He's trying to move things along. But we have not, I don't think the Democratic Party has quite failed politically yet the way it had in the 1970s. And we will find out if it does.
Felicia, yeah.
Sorry, I have a question for Zach based on what he just said, because the story that we so often hear about the rise of Friedmanism and ultimately about the political rise of economic conservatism, which some of us like to call neoliberalism, which we can get into. But anyway, the story we hear is like, the problem was stagflation, right? The problem was that Keynesianism could not explain why we had both, wage inflation, price inflation and wage stagnation. But it sounds like you don't buy that, and you have a much more political argument about coalitions that started to come apart. So I'm wondering if you could just tease that out a little bit.
I think the stagflation stuff is part of the story. It's certainly something that economists at the time would talk about and say leave. So the idea there is that there was a trade-off between employment and prices. So you could have a lot of unemployment or you could have a lot of inflation, but you couldn't have both at the same time. And we had that in the 1970s. People said, the whole Keynesian thing must not work. It's not really clear when you look at the data in the 1970s that stagflation, first of all, was a particularly serious problem. It's not obvious at all that it was that it conflicted with this sort of economic theory that John Maynard Keynes had put forward in the 1930s. Certainly with the textbook version that had been proliferated over the previous 10 years, there's some tension, but it doesn't strike me as this overpowering, just, coup de grace for the use of management of aggregate demand. And you can see this because, when you get economic conservatives in charge, they keep doing a sort of more right-wing version of Keynesian economics, even in the Reagan years to some extent. So I don't think the intellectual case alone is the comprehensive explanation. I think the Democratic Party falling apart just made it vulnerable to a takeover by somebody with an alternative explanation. They could just point and say, look, that thing over there is wrong. We have something else and we're going to do it. And because the Democratic Party just couldn't get its act together, for a bunch of different reasons, that new view, which had a lot of money behind it, and also a lot of media behind it. And one of the things people forget about the neoliberals is they weren't just like, people at the University of Chicago pointing to charts and graphs. Milton Friedman had a television show. He was on PBS at a time when there was no cable TV.
Hayek had cartoons and right. The Reader's Digest version of Road to Serfdom, which obviously was half a generation before, but still.
Newsweek, which mainstreamed him quite a considerable amount.
Yeah.
Yes. So there was a direct to the masses strategy that these people deployed quite effectively, and they had very simple explanations. In particular with Friedman, I don't think conservatives were really persuaded that much by rank and file conservatives, certainly by the arguments he was putting forward. If you look at what he's saying and take him seriously, and I do think Friedman was sincere in this. It's hard for people to believe that in retrospect, but he had a deep faith in the ability of markets to bring about a more egalitarian, progressive society. It seems almost kind of childlike, I think, in retrospect, but he really did believe that these things were going to make society more egalitarian. They were going to narrow income inequality. They were going to eliminate racial disparities between Black and white America. All of this great good stuff was going to happen from the free market, and he's allied with Barry Goldwater and the Republican Party, people who have absolutely no interest in the free market achieving that. And so there's a very cynical political coalition that's being put together by people who are using Friedman as sort of an intellectual shield for people in the academy and for people who read Newsweek, but also to try to win over liberals, to say, hey, look, this guy, sure, there are a bunch of racists over here if you like look under the hood of the Goldwater coalition here, but look, this guy actually believes what you believe. He wants to have a better, more just world. He just has a different sort of theory for how we can best get there and be most effective with it. And because the Democratic Party didn't have a particularly effective message to give in response, I think largely because of the Vietnam War, it was hard to believe that the Democratic Party was really looking out for working people and had a great idea for how to direct the country. And that gave Friedman and his sort of political masters a tremendous opportunity.
Yeah, Friedmanism really did migrate into the Democratic Party. Osita, I wanted to ask, we've been at this for a while. We were covering the Democratic primary of 2020 between Joe Biden and his fellow Democrats. Was there a moment during the Democratic primary where you thought to yourself, Joe Biden, this is the man who's going to usher Milton Friedman from the American scene?
There was not, and to be frank with you, I'm still not sure that's where I'm at in sort of understanding things, although I think it's definitely true that you've seen over the last couple of months a real break from Democratic policy orthodoxy on a few fronts. First of all, I should give some amount of full disclosure that I'm sitting here not only as a writer and observer of American politics, but also a graduate of the policy school at the University of Chicago, which gives me a kind of real, sense of almost Catholic guilt about being involved in this conversation, because I think it's true that Friedmanism has waned, is on decline in terms of its influence, but also was sort of getting in certain spots a double-barreled shotgun of it to the face within the last 10 years at some of our major policy institutions. But the point there is that, I think that there's an extent to which you can see the ideas kind of atrophying, but at the same time, you do have to wonder if they're not being, transformed, altered to better suit the political moment. One of the things that really struck me about Zach's piece is his revisiting of, I forget what it's called, but that piece that Friedman did about corporate social responsibility. This idea that it was a real betrayal of just economic principles to have corporations going out of their way to declare themselves as supportive of social causes. That this was this was a real undermining of the functioning of democracy within the economic system as Friedman understood it. And it was only really resonated to me now, given that we're seeing on the right the kind of revival of angst and anger about the extent to which corporations are involving themselves on particular social questions. All of this revolt that we're seeing against woke capital, in the sense that it's not right for Coca-Cola or Nike, whoever it is, to say that they're for voting rights, to say that they support LGBT people. Now I was just sort of thinking about what to do with that over the course of the piece, because in one way it does resemble, the basic complaint that Friedman is laying out. But on the other hand, the conservatives who are saying that right now aren't doing it on the same kinds of grounds. They're not saying that there's some kind of alternative free market principle that's underlying our revulsion here. They're really appealing more to kind of a paleo-conservative rejection of free market economics as a whole. As Zach was saying, it was a very odd coalition in the conservative movement to begin with, the idea that you would have people who had these sort of cultural values aligning themselves with the forces of the market. So your question was about the Democratic Party and Joe Biden. But I think that broadly speaking, ideas are never really fully dead, right? They don't disappear once they lose popularity. They're always kind of there to be repurposed, revitalized, if a political moment, if some particular group's interests is aligned with the possibilities inherent in their revival, right? And so as we're thinking about the extent to which we're really experiencing a transformative economic moment now, I think we also have to be on guard for the ways in which seemingly dead and buried ideas can be picked up again and put to new purpose. And again, it's not really clear to me on the Democratic Party side, the extent to which we're fully out of the woods yet with Friedmanism. You talked about that Tom Tomorrow cartoon at the very beginning. When I think about these conversations, often I think about another kind of similar vision offered not in a cartoon, but in a tweet, but I think it was Chapo Trap House's Matt Crispin within the last couple of years or so. And in this tweet, he imagines, a similar post-apocalyptic landscape. Everything has been destroyed. But the last living creature is this kind of decayed, withering husk who's only capable of saying one phrase: how are we going to pay for it? Right. And I think we're still, in spite of the progress that's been made, the progress you see in things like the American Rescue Plan, we're still in that mode. We're having this conversation now that the extent to which the infrastructure plan has to have these kinds of fairy dust pay-fors baked into it politically in order to sell it to the public and to moderate legislators. The administration has said that, people in the administration have said, we had this spending to deal with COVID, but we're going to sort of dial things back because we're anxious about the way the inflation is going to be interpreted on the political scene. If we don't dial things back, we're going to have this crisis over the debt ceiling very soon. So it's not obvious to me that we're fully out of the woods yet, and I've taken up enough time. But I think there are encouraging signs, but also signs that Milton Friedman could continue to haunt us as a zombie, maybe long dead. But maybe there are ways in which we can see these ideas continuing to influence our policy and our politics. Maybe not as obviously as they might have in the past, but in certain new ways.
I would sort of contest that a little bit, Osita, because a couple of things. First of all, yes, we are having a sort of odd pay-for conversation. But, there are a lot of us and a lot more of us now who are arguing two things. One is that actually deficit financing a lot of public infrastructure investments is actually a smart way to make sure that we are able to decarbonize our economy and actually to create whole new economic sectors. So that's like one important thing that is that I didn't think I was going to see amongst mainstream Democratic Party politicians, and yet we're seeing it. I thought it was only going to be sort of like my colleague Mike Consul and Paul Krugman and a few other lefties, but actually you're seeing that a lot more from a lot more people. And I think we're going to see that more as the summer continues. It is true that Joe Biden himself is not interested in that right now. We'll just see where the politics take us on some of this. That's the first thing. And then the second thing is that even Joe Biden a year ago was running on a $3.3 trillion set of tax increases, mostly on corporations and mostly on the rich. And these are ideas that definitely are post-neoliberal, and I would say that go far beyond at least the ways in which Friedmanomics played itself out in the 80s and the 90s, in the Clinton era. So I think there are a lot of different ways, pay for is quote unquote only being one of them, that we're actually seeing the debate, the terms of the debate considerably shift from where we were even a couple of years ago.
I think it's absolutely true, and I've written the same myself. I mean, during the primary, as skeptical as I was about certain things, I wrote this piece for Slate. This is really in the pre-primary. I mean, the primary lasted like half a decade, it seems like. But I mean, I guess it was in 2018 or late 2017, I wrote about this piece called "Centrism is Dead." How the candidates were not looking to third way to fill out their campaign platforms. They were looking to a lot of economists who had been out on the edge of the party, or articles in Vox, to take upon the ideas that they're going to present. There's this moment where people talking about a job guarantee that was very exciting. You had people nominally support Medicare for all, and I think now you're right that there are people even within the administration who I think are taking a more ambitious view about what is possible through government action than they would have, or than they did under Obama. At the same time, though, it does seem like the people who are actually in a pivotal position to decide what's going to get passed with this Democratic majority aren't fully on board. I don't know that the press is fully on board. But I think the larger thing that I think about a lot is the extent to which we're really happy that we've come to a place where more prominent Democrats are willing to support large expansions of the welfare state, are willing to support deficit spending to an extent that they weren't before. And all of that is real. At the same time, it seems to me that a lot of the problems that we fundamentally face as a country are not exclusively problems of the size of the welfare state, the size of our transfer programs, right? Climate change, their welfare state programs are going to help there, obviously, when it comes to making sure people are cared for and transition to clean energy, building resilience, economic resilience. But that is a problem largely of hard infrastructure investments, right? And really fundamentally transforming the energy economy in like kind of concrete ways. It's not just a matter of, sending out payments to people. There's something more fundamental there. Even when it comes to policy like racial inequality or concern like racial inequality, obviously really building the welfare state, making sure that we're caring for the very poor, through programs that have been decimated over the past couple of decades is very important. At the same time, communities like West Baltimore, not very far from where I live in Baltimore, they actually have to be rebuilt. Like, they have to be like sort of materially re-resourced. You have to go in there and sort of like build new schools and hospitals, and not only that, but just sort of think about how to make long-term kinds of reparative investments and changes. They're not just matters of sending out money to people or funding this or that welfare program more generously. The problem of wealth inequality as a whole, is to a large extent a problem of labor rights, right? The fact that we've had our labor movement decimated over the last couple of decades, problem that workers don't really have any kind of autonomy or capacity to participate in corporate decision making, right? All of that seems like parts of our economic conversation that, because we've been fighting this fight on the welfare state for so long, we don't really have a real set of our political bearings on quite yet, right? We've won this partial victory against Friedmanism, but the problems that are looming ahead of us now are so large that like it's almost as though, I mean, the fight against Friedmanism is one that we should have won like 30 years ago. So we could turn to these other things and think more fundamentally about restructuring the economy. When it comes to things like labor rights and worker power and that kind of stuff. So that's what I really think about a lot. Like I understand that there have been positive changes that you can see in the things that people, even in the administration, are saying, even if Joe Biden is willing to say them themselves. But, you know, I think we're at a point where the real next frontier is going to be moving beyond how can we sort of patch up and repair the welfare state to how can we fundamentally, you know, I think the fundamental thing is realign the power in the economy in such a way that working people in this country have more power than they otherwise would have. And this was a conversation you had a little bit during the primary. Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders talked about co-determination. They talked about granting workers, or Bernie Sanders in particular talked about granting workers a certain portion of the shares in major corporations, right? That's something that hasn't really been a major part of progressive policy discourse. And it seems to me like when you talk about wealth inequality, when we have an economy where you have individual people making $100 billion, right? You have these mega corporations that can go into cities and start making demands about tax policy and regulation without any sort of engagement with the democratic process. Like it takes more than raising taxes and giving money to other people to really deal with those problems. And I feel like that's the next fight. That's where we still have to do the most work, even though we've made progress on very important battles when it comes to beating the Friedmanites on the question of how large our welfare state should be.
This confusing a question I have.
Just quickly, I think we've made a lot of progress on all of those things, which I'm happy to talk about. I think it's actually more than simply the question of how we pay for investments. But Jason, you're the moderator, so I'm going to turn it to you.
I just wanted to know, it seems to me like Osita's right, the challenges that are ahead of us are pretty massive. At the same time, the challenge we're putting behind us was also pretty massive. And I think it exposed a lot of frailties in our political economy, in our policy, in baseline policies like healthcare provision, social provision, job protection, and just like the basics of how we deliver a dignified life to people. If there's a shift underway where Friedmanism is being moved from the scene, what's coming to take its place, and how quickly might it take its place? You know, Zach has written a book about the life of John Maynard Keynes. I imagine that part of the rationale he had when he embarked on that quest was perhaps an itching notion that the pendulum might swing back to something more Keynesian. I know that Zach has also had a lot of opportunity to talk to Stephanie Kelton, who has completely sort of like remixed our whole idea about money and deficit. So what's coming to take its place, and how quickly might it get here?
I think as Osita points out, there's a ways to go here, and it's clearly possible that the president could find his attachments to Senate procedure more powerful than his attachments to changing the paradigm. But I do think if you look at the things Biden himself has said here, there's reason for some rational optimism here. I mean, Biden gave a press conference in March where he said multiple times, I want to change the paradigm. He used the word paradigm. I want to change the paradigm. And when he was asked what he meant by that, he said, I want to reward work, not just wealth. So that's a big idea. That doesn't just cover the minimum wage. He's talking about changing the way the economy is, what the priorities of the economic system are. He gave a big sort of update. I can't remember if it was actually a State of the Union. I don't think it was. It was like a month after that speech in February, where he said, look, we've been talking about the government all wrong for the past 25 years. The government is not some foreign occupying force. It is us. It's we the people. And I think Felicia can talk about the ultimate origin of that quote, which I was not aware of. But that's a direct attack on not just Friedman's economics, but his conception of democracy. I mean, Friedman really believed that the true democracy lived in a free market independent of the state. And what Biden is saying is that democracy is something we have to decide to do together. It doesn't just work out because a bunch of charts and graphs hit an equilibrium point. It's something we have to manage. And there's a lot to that. There's a foreign policy dimension. I mean, I think when we talk about climate change, we're not just talking about new insulation and a better energy grid and stuff. We're talking about the relationship between the U.S. and China. And for the last 25 years, the sort of decline in U.S. emissions has been a product largely of us just shipping that elsewhere, in particular to China. So there has to be a more cooperative international dimension to this stuff, which reacts with foreign policy priorities in a way. The thing that I want people to remember about the sort of time that this shifted prior to Friedman, when the Keynesian paradigm became dominant in the 1930s and 1940s, it wasn't like the left just took everything over and we had people from the Chapo trap house of the 1930s in charge of the Democratic Party. What happened is that the centrists, the people who everybody
stereotypes,
everybody thought was totally square and had their heads up their butts for the previous 20 years while the country was going to hell, those people all sort of got wise and started doing things that made a lot of sense because they believed rationally that they could actually make a difference and create the type of change that 15 or 20 years earlier they had not believed was possible. And I think when somebody like Joe Biden, I think his personal transformation here is significant. The guy's not a left winger. And when he talks about this stuff, he's not trying to appeal to his critics in the primary who were backing Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, people like me. He's saying this because he thinks it's true. And he thinks, and that to me suggests that there is a shift in the horizon of what people believe is possible within the Democratic Party. And that's always where it has really mattered. The conservatives have never wanted to do this stuff. They didn't want to do it Milton Friedman was too progressive for them. You have to remember that. They didn't believe what Friedman was saying. It was the Democratic Party's willingness to go along with and adopt some tenets of Friedmanism that made it such a powerful force. And I think having that out of the way opens up just a tremendous horizon of possibilities.
I think there are actually 4 different ways in which our economics now are different from Friedmanomics. And I think it's worth going through all of them. I think the first is around the willingness of Democrats, the Biden administration, and other Democrats, obviously Elizabeth Warren, to use government to actually regulate and try to control the market power of large corporations. Lena Khan's appointment to the chairpersonship of the FTC is a case in point here. You have many, many, many other examples of places where Democrats are starting to say we actually need to deal with the power of large corporations. That's point number 1. I think point number 2 is the part that Osita was saying, well, it's more than just the welfare state. Yes, but it is also about actually publicly providing for people who do not have enough, the child tax credit, the expansion of the tax credit, and obviously the conversation we continue to have around healthcare expansion, Medicare for all, or Medicare for many, or Medicare for more, wherever we are on that these days. Like, there is a whole new set of examples around public provisioning that goes, again, far beyond Friedmanism. So that's point number 2. Point number 3 is something we haven't actually talked about yet, but I think might be the most exciting and the most interesting, which is the willingness of not just the Biden folks, but actually both parties to start really thinking about industrial policy, meaning let's use the power of the state to actually direct industry in certain directions. Let's not just let the market take, the growth of corporate sectors where it wants to go, but actually let's talk about the power of government to not just spend R&D to combat climate change and to decarbonize the economy, but let's actually invest in battery production. Let's use the power of government to like buy hundreds of thousands of electric vehicles. Let's talk about solar. Let's talk about wind. So that's what a lot of the infrastructure conversation is right now. And that is industrial policy in a way we have not seen in this country for at least 75 years. And then the last point, which actually gets right back to your piece, Zach, which I loved. We're actually talking about an economy that does need to be democratically managed and governed. And your point about, which means we actually need a democracy, which we could talk about. But your point about Friedman, you point out that Friedman actually really feared democracy, which is one of the reasons he wanted the market to determine individual people's choices, because he thought that most voters were ill-informed and were going to lead us down a path of ruin. So I think a democratic economy is the fourth important piece that we are starting to see develop in a new set of economic ideas.
It is really interesting. We do seem to be at this weird place post-pandemic where it does seem there's an opportunity for people who've had very bad jobs to sort of reassert themselves in the labor economy. And I know that Joe Biden has actually sort of like made this explicit. He wants employers to start competing for workers again. These opportunities are there and they're rich. At the same time, when we talk about, use the government to regulate large corporations, there's a 6-3 majority in the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has very, very much over history sided with corporate power, even in cases where they haven't had such a dominant conservative majority. We talk about public provision, as Osita brings up, stuff like the child tax credit. There's no guarantee we're going to extend that. There's no guarantee we're going to get some of that stuff past the Senate. I definitely feel like conversations have shifted in ways that are profound, but power seems to still be holding sway in the opposite direction. Am I wrong about that?
No, I don't think so. I do think, consider the Supreme Court here. I mean, the NCAA ruling got a lot of attention.
Sure, yeah.
Last week. This was, a relatively progressive thing from a conservative court, opening the door for athletes to be paid in college athletics. One of the problems with that decision, when you dig into it, there's stuff in there that really suggests, some pretty old-fashioned ideas about the relationship between the state and the market. There's this idea that markets kind of, predate the state historically and intellectually, that markets are over here doing this one thing. We don't want the state to come in and interfere with them because markets have this, it was a very Friedman-esque kind of implication in the 9-0 decision. So I do think the legal profession is behind the curve. And part of that is because, those people are old and were brought up in a different era. But part of that is also that, once you get a new consensus among the economists, it just takes some time to get it out to the lawyers. But part of that is also because part of shaping the consensus is an act of political power. You need an administration and a Congress to start doing things before the legal profession will start feeling pressure to follow along. They don't even necessarily feel pressure. They just start seeing things intuitively in a different way. Now, do I think that the Roberts Court is going to be a partner in a progressive post-neoliberal economy? I mean, absolutely not. I think
the decision, to your point, Nursery versus Hasid suggests no.
Yeah, no. So clearly, some sort of reform agenda is going to be required there, and I think that reforms to Senate procedures are going to be necessary as well. But even the setbacks that you've seen over the past few months, which are more just sort of a delay than anything else so far. Joe Manchin is going out and saying he's still on board with 2 infrastructure bills. I mean, we're going to see where the details go here, but but it's totally plausible that the most conservative Democrat in Congress is going to sign off on a $5 or $6 trillion overhaul of the American economy, with all sorts of new energy investments and industrial policy implications. That door hasn't closed yet. That door is wide open. And I think if you see people like Joe Manchin go through it, then it's possible you see people like Joe Manchin start talking about reforming the courts. Will they do it the way that I would have wanted them to a year and a half ago? No. But I think the change in ideas here means that there is a greater opportunity for political change than I believe was possible before the pandemic.
I wanted to ask, how will ordinary people who are not steeped in economic lore or economic academia get a sense that a change is moving, that something's happening in their lives, that a new consensus is forming? What are the signs on the horizon that we should all be looking for?
I mean, look at all those ordinary people just telling employers to take their jobs and shove them. I mean, it's extraordinary right now. We still have a almost 6% unemployment rate here, but the job shortage narrative that employers and the Wall Street Journal have been talking about for months, it's real. People cannot get workers for these crappy jobs because workers don't want to do it, and something is going to give there. And I don't think it's going to be the workers. We've already seen the federal extension boost to unemployment benefits expire in most of the conservative states. People are still not taking crappy jobs. I think that's a pretty clear sign that that ordinary people believe they have the ability to demand more, and are not just hoping and praying for a better day, but actually refusing to do work they don't want to do because they believe that a better opportunity is around the corner. And
that is worker power, to your point, Osita. I mean, it's not the only sign of worker power. There are lots of other things we need to do to have more formal, more either unionized or somehow otherwise organized worker power. But if workers can walk away from a job because you have a tight labor market, and we are going to privilege that rather than worry about, what I see is episodic inflation, at least that's what it looks like right now, according to the data, people are going to really feel that. You can walk away from a job that is extremely meaningful to, people's day-to-day lives.
So you wrote today about how you felt that a lot of what we understood about American democracy and American politics are going to are either going to change or become evident, are no longer working the way we expect them to. What do you have to say about the possibility that there is this paradigm shift potentially happening in our sort of economic ideas against the stuff you read about today?
You mean, how much do I believe that certain ideas no longer can be taken for granted in the economic sphere as well? Is our political sphere?
Yeah, I was wondering, just like, there seemed to, we have like your thesis and Zach's thesis both sort of like suggest there's a tidal shift happening.
Yeah.
And I wanted to know if having thought about the idea that Friedmanism is fading from the scene, if that affected your thinking at all when you talk more broadly about the future of our democracy and the future of American politics.
Yeah, I think the piece is about the extent to which, when you look at least political conversations we're having now about democracy and voting rights, the real shift there is that I think a large portion of the American electorate has come to see basic structural factors and the design of our political institutions as being really, really important in a way that they might not have considered 10, 15, 20 years ago. It's a really striking thing that like a huge portion of the Democratic base is fired up about Section 4 of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, right? Like it's pretty wild thing for people to be fired up about it and going to the polls for. But that reflects the extent to which people are thinking structurally And as I say in that piece, it's not just people in the Democratic Party. There are ways in which you can understand some of the craziness that's happening now on the right when it comes to things like critical race theory, and all that. There's a way you can see that as a kind of structural thinking too. Basically, people on both sides are saying to themselves, well, elections happen, campaigns happen, but underneath all of that, there are certain forces at work that we haven't really taken seriously before, and we should really turn our attention to them. And I think you can really, I think that that's also probably true in the way that we think about the economy as well, particularly given the crisis we've all been through. You know, I wonder if, as that kind of says, and as Felicia kind of says, people who are now having the power to sort of say no to crappy jobs or think to themselves, well, there's something that happened in the economy that's allowing me to do this that I wasn't aware of before. And there are certain mechanisms in the economy that will give me as a worker more power if they work out a certain way than I had before this crisis happened. I wonder if people are developing that kind of sensibility. If they are, it's a really important thing because, as Felicia says, that is a kind of worker power. And so I think that the task of savvy politicians who want to pull the electorate even further is to tell people, well, you know, you remember that power you had in the summer of 2021 to say no to that crappy job or to make more demands from your employers as to what you would need in order to stay in your position. What if we could institutionalize that in sort of forms of organization that will regularize your ability to extract certain demands from your bosses, right? That's the next step. That's only possible if people are thinking in the first place in a more structural way about the way the economy functions and just sort of understanding there's a system, this kind of system of basically calamities, right? The way the economy works for most people is, oh, you know, the stock market's down today. I guess that means like something bad happened I don't really understand, and maybe, you know, I'll lose my job, or, you know, the system is not really intelligible to people. But if there are ways in which people can glom on to certain structural frameworks for thinking about the way the economy works now in the midst of this crisis, I think that'll be useful for getting people to think more ambitiously about the kinds of policies that might be possible in the future in order to cement the power that they're feeling right now. And people are looking for structural answers. I mean, the piece that I did, I guess it was in late 2019, not long after I started here, was a piece about MMT and Stephanie Culton and all those people. But it wasn't about them as much as it was this conference that I went to, where I talked to a lot of like regular folks, people who had been laid off, people who working, not making a whole lot of money, who found their way to this pretty like high-end abstract economics conference because they happened across a post on the internet somewhere, and then found a way of thinking about the economy that sort of made their experiences intelligible to them. And whatever you think about MMT, you know, just sort of substantively, a lot of the power in that movement and in other movements that have sort of changed policymaking in this country, you could say this about Milton Friedman as well, is that for people who are looking for ways to simplify and understand forces that had not been really accessible to them, there are certain economic systems or people who are good at explaining economic systems that can be real magnets for people who are looking for direction. I just hope that in the years ahead, those people are captured by a progressive movement that utilizes the opportunity that this crisis has presented to pull them in a direction where they're thinking more deeply about, you know, labor power and all these kinds of things, and not, I don't know, woke capital or something, right? The battle is on for the next thing that's going to be the answer or the model that's going to sway people in the way that Friedmanism did, only on our side.
Second, Felicia, I was wondering if this is a question from one of our audience members. I wonder if you feel like if it's possible to gauge whether or not Biden right now is more informed by the fruits of the crisis we're living through right now, this post-pandemic economy, or if he is nevertheless like holding on to some memory about this lackluster economic recovery that occurred when he was vice president under Obama.
I actually think it's three things. I definitely think if anybody learned from the Democratic primary in 2020, it was Joe Biden. Like it is not an accident that many of the ideas that both Senator Warren and Senator Sanders were putting forward in that primary have made their way into some of what we are seeing in the Biden administration. So I definitely think and some of the people, by the way. So, you know, you look at Bharat Ramamurthy, who had been, you know, Elizabeth Warren's, one of her chief economic advisors, you know, is now a deputy to Brian Deese on the NEC. So you see a lot of, like, Biden learned not just from COVID, but actually from the hard fought ideas primary. For a hot minute, it was an ideas primary in 2020. I think that's the first thing. I think definitely Biden also, and Jared Bernstein and others, remember the long, slow, jobless recovery. You know, between 2010 and 2014, close to half of the jobs that were actually created in that period were poverty jobs, right? And so people were really suffering during that economic period, and guaranteed Biden and his economic advisors remember that. But then I think the third thing we have to remember is that Joe Biden grew up. I mean, Joe Biden is close to 80 years old. He's a pre-neoliberal, right? He grew up in a world in which there was actually, you know, in a Delaware where DuPont Chemical was powerful, but part of their power was to do civic good. This is before Milton Friedman's 1970 sort of social responsibility of business is to make profits, you know. And so Biden and Ted Kaufman and many other of his advisors, the people from his very early political career, remember a kind of, you know, they're not afraid of large corporations actually, but they remember when large corporations could act in the civic interest. And so I think there is a kind of old-fashioned way that Biden thinks about the economy that's not to be taken lightly. Last thing I'll say here is that the thing that I've been most surprised about Biden's economics is how much race equity has been woven into a lot of what he has tried to put forward in his climate plans, in his early executive orders. You know, the Treasury Department right now is talking about, in fact, the Deputy Treasury Secretary is leading a racial wealth gap task force, which I never thought I would see coming from the Treasury Secretary's office. So there are a lot of interesting things, and I think new things that I am pleasantly surprised to see coming out of Team Biden.
I mean, Zach, you tweeted not too long ago that that as a sort of perennial critic of Democrats' approach to economic policy, that Biden hadn't been giving you much to work with. Now, of course, this was some weeks ago. This was, I think, coming out of the passage of the COVID relief bill. This is before we got kind of into this rather strange bog down over an infrastructure bill and a potential budget reconciliation. But I was wondering if you've had the occasion to, like, revisit that idea, that assertion, whether or not you still stand by it, or whether or not you become a little bit more skeptical on your own about it.
Well, certainly I've been frustrated by his approach to the Senate. I mean, I'm not going to pretend that I've enjoyed watching I filed that piece for TNR in 6 weeks ago, 8 weeks ago, something like that. You know, and I assume by the time we put it up that at least one of these infrastructure bills would have been made law.
It's fair to blame our dead pre-production schedule. That's fine.
It wasn't that, though. I mean, I think it's been very slow, and I think you know, part of that is an odd strategy from the Biden administration. I think part of that's just a little bit of disorganization within the administration, to be blunt. But you know, if they pass a $6 trillion overhaul of the American economy, I mean, that's basically we're talking about a massive transfer of wealth and power there. The economy is about $21 trillion, something like that a year. I mean, we're talking about a massive change in the structure of the economy with that. Now, I do feel like politically, the Biden administration is putting a lot of eggs in the economic basket here if they do not address the filibuster and voting rights. I think you're just hoping that because policy works out very well economically, that that voters reward you for that in the fall. And there are all sorts of structural reasons to believe that that is a foolish gamble. Even if it works out, it's an awful lot of risk to be taking on. So I do hope that the Biden administration takes voting rights more seriously here, and recognizes that as a priority that is at the very least co-equal with the infrastructure project. But one reason that I think that people in some corners of the left are a little skeptical of the ambition or hesitant to recognize the ambition of the Biden plan is because it's called an infrastructure plan. And he's done that for a reason. I mean, he's done that to sort of project the moderate centrism of this thing that is like 9 times the size of what Barack Obama did when he took office.
Yeah, that's worth pointing out.
This, you can use the word infrastructure, and I don't think it's dishonest, but it's a very particular choice of word to describe to label the package. I mean, this is an overhaul of the American economy in a way that 15 years ago would have been considered very left-wing. Today, I don't think it's considered quite so left-wing or even left-wing at all, because the intellectual consensus on this stuff has shifted so much. But this is an economic agenda that is just simply inconceivable from the Obama administration.
I feel like we're at this very historic moment where we've learned so much about the frailty of the economy. We've learned so much about the frailty of our democracy. It is a time where I feel if we don't get new ideas, we're going to be in a world of hurt. Are you optimistic that even if we are able to usher some of these bad ideas from the scene, that we're going to be able to convince the American people to come along on a new sort of consensus about the way the country should be run, the way social provision should be doled out, the government's role in offering more in terms of being able to distribute dignified lives to people? Because we're coming out of like this horrible election season, and it does seem to me like, there's significant divisions among the American people. Right now, we've been talking about a significant division among the American people over whether to get vaccinated, and which could prove to be significant in terms of like whether we survive the next COVID variant that comes to these shores. Do new economic ideas have the power to bring unity to a place where there hasn't been there before?
I mean, never underestimate the power of conservative movement and conservative media to mobilize people for foolish ends. I think if what you're hoping for is, if what you mean by unity is unanimity, no, we won't get that. But do I believe that most people want to have a more egalitarian future in which they have more political and economic power than they have now? I think most people do want that. And I think when the Biden administration and the Democratic Party more broadly talk about their economic priorities like that, I think they're able to reach voters that they assumed weren't interested in economic questions, frankly, in a lot of the 2020 election, but also for much of the last 25 years. I think a lot of people in Washington saw economic questions as sort of technical questions that it was up to the Fed and economists to work out, and they were going to talk about other issues that voters actually cared about. And I think the more, I think economic questions have been the sort of central motivating force in American society since the financial crisis. You can't separate these questions about a fair economy from all the questions about race and gender and identity that the left has, is always talking about. I mean, they're all embedded and tied up together. And when you talk about economic power, you're talking about all of that stuff. But for some reason, talking about it in an economic lens, I think reaches a lot of people who maybe don't think of themselves as being super progressive or culturally progressive or part of the club. So I think it's an opportunity to expand the the sort of participatory power of American democracy. I'm optimistic.
Felicia, you're optimistic?
Me?
Yeah.
I wish I used to be that optimistic actually. And for the last hour, I've been all about, the new ideas are here. The new paradigm has overturned Friedman. And I actually agree with that on the economic piece. And yet, never underestimate the power of American racism to overturn very rational, very smart, very growth-oriented economic ideas. And I fear that without a strategic and an assiduous way to combat that, that doesn't re-trigger a backlash in the opposite direction, even the best economics might not win. We have great economics now. I'm worried about the rest of it.
Osita, even perhaps that you're most pessimistic about the future of American democracy as we understand it to be structured in the way it is today, you've always tended to flick at the notion that there's a way of disintermediating power. There's a place well beyond Washington where ordinary people can sort of align in their own defense, whether it's labor organizing, whether it's operating more locally, more at ground level toward politics, away from big money and big influencers. Do you think that there is a place where this notion that these bad economic ideas are sort of leaving the zeitgeist, and the possibility that democracy might be taken up in smaller but more powerful hands in the future? Is there a place where those two ideas maybe align?
I think so. I mean, I think that the durability of this economic shift, or this shift in economic thinking, is going to depend upon the extent to which the American people actually internalize that shift and start thinking about the economy in different ways themselves, and not just, policy thinkers and professionals in Washington, D.C. and certain Democratic politicians. Obviously, I think that all Americans kind of intuitively feel, I won't say all Americans, most Americans intuitively feel like they want a more egalitarian economy, an economy that works for everybody. I think most Americans have visceral frustrations with their lack of power in the economy as it's currently constructed. But that doesn't necessarily translate into a durable shift to a more progressive economic paradigm. I mean, we can look at the situation in the Senate and say that the real issue here is the extent to which Joe Biden has or hasn't made enough calls to Joe Manchin or Kyrsten Sinema. And if he did more, then maybe that would change things just as a consequence of his own skill at negotiating things in Washington. I think I've myself written that the president should be doing more. At the same time, Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin and other people in the Democratic coalition have made a bet that their electorates are not going to penalize them for pumping the brakes on what the newer voices in the Biden administration, people who are advancing these new economic consensus, are trying to do. And as best as we can tell from polling, at least, that bet seems to be kind of correct. I mean, Kyrsten Sinema is not polling poorly in Arizona right now. Joe Manchin is not polling poorly in West Virginia right now, despite being the primary thorns in the side of the people who are trying to make this economic shift, or the shift in the economic consensus, happen. So there's real work to be done there in getting ordinary folks to think differently about the economy. I mean, it's not that these people are nefarious or bad, but I just think that the American people have internalized so much of Friedmanism and so much of this paradigm over the last couple of decades that it's going to take real on the ground kind of long-term organizing, connecting with people to bring them to a different place. And I just don't think that the electorate is is quite where people like me and people like Felicia and people like Zach are. I think that, they're never going to say that the deficit is their primary concern. That's never been the case. At the same time, when a politician comes out and says, well, that's really expensive, or there are certain ways in which this is going to hurt our ability to, job creators are going to suffer. Like those are messages that still have a resonance in the parts of the country that are actually pivotal to determining whether or not something gets passed in the United States Senate, and this is why I talked about the press at the very beginning. It's true that there are places in the media right now where you can get a different perspective and you can hear from these new voices and you can read wonderful excerpts of papers from the Roosevelt Institute that break from economic consensus. But I think in the places where most of the people turn to for the political analyses, for the analysis of what's possible in our politics and our policy, there are still people in a pretty conservative mode and sort of trying to constrain the Biden administration's ability to act, or their ability to present. There are people. The short answer is that there are people who are going to make a big deal about inflation throughout the rest of this year in the mainstream press, and people are going to make a big deal about the debt. And that those are forces that I think are going to be a real political challenge still, even given as much progress as we've made. So that's a long way of saying that all the stuff that I talk about a lot, this idea that real power and real hope for the future probably lies within the capacity of ordinary American people to demand political change. That is still a big part of this economic picture that we're thinking about kind of abstractly tonight. Like I think the extent to which these abstract reconsiderations of how the economy should work really hold and have a real policy impact, and to the extent that they have a policy impact, that policy impact survives attacks that are coming due to racism and things like Felicia talked about and other concerns, like that the success of the post-Friedman era is going to depend upon the extent to which people at the ground level of politics have been brought along for this intellectual journey that we're having. And I'm not sure that we are in a place where we can say confidently that the American people at the ground level are quite there yet. If they were, we would not be having as much trouble in the Senate as we are right now, because ultimately the people who are making decisions that the Biden administration ought to be constrained are responding to the composition of the electorate in those places. And unfortunately, given the design of our political system, unless the mindset of those electorates change, we're going to be stuck, and our ability to actually make good on the promise of post-Friedman economics is going to be limited.
Can I make 2 points here before we go?
Yeah,
because I think Sita's making pretty reasonable points here. I don't think ordinary people are walking down the street worrying about economic data or debt economists most of the time. They're not thinking about inflation. They're not thinking about the price of cereal. They're not wondering if used cars are responsible for what share of the most recent inflation report. They're not thinking about the national debt. They think about these things for a little bit, maybe when they enter into if they get asked by a pollster, or if there's a debate on TV or something. I think most people have internalized political failure for the last 25 years. People have internalized the idea the government either does not want to or cannot actually represent their interests economically and otherwise, but particularly economically. And that is a really hard sort of pattern to persuade people that it's hard to persuade people that pattern can be broken. But I do think one reason for optimism is what happened in COVID. As horrible as the last year and a half has been, in 2020, we had the worst economic disaster in a century, which is saying something, because we'd had the worst economic disaster in almost a century just 10 years earlier. And yet, for most people, the vast majority of working people, their incomes rose over the course of that disaster. We saw an economic management structure, management and response that was just much, much more successful and effective than anything that I think people had seen during their lifetimes. I think it opens, that doesn't necessarily open every door, but it does turn a key. I'm running out of metaphors here. But I think that does sort of that gives me some reason to hope that people can believe that, you know, things that they had once believed were not possible may be possible now.
Felicia, do you have any final thoughts about this? Sorry, I don't have a more specific question to tee up to you.
I hope Zach's right.
Yeah, we could all be back here a year from now. Maybe we could revisit these ideas, see where we're at. I'd be up for that. Folks, the world only spins forward. We could fill the vacuum that Milton Friedman's leaving behind with something more just and more equitable, or we could not. We will only have time to find out. With that, I'm afraid it's time to bring our live stream to its end. For those of you who want to know about our next event, it's going to feature TNR's literary editor, Laura Marsh. She'll be talking with Nicola Twilley and Jeff Manaugh about their new work, Until Proven Safe, The History and Future of Quarantine. That's going to be on July 28th, which is my birthday. Come celebrate it with Laura at 7 p.m. In the meantime, I want to thank tonight's guests, Zach Carter, Felicia Wong, Osita Nwanevu, for participating in this. It would be very cool to get back together a year from now and see where we are at in terms of our political economy and the preservation of our democracy and the distribution of a more equitable future for all Americans. Hopefully we get there. From all of us here at the New Republic, in the meantime, wish you all the best. Thanks for allowing us into your homes tonight, and have a lovely night.